Center. And, we just had a Humanities Center brown bag moment where people who have not known each other, who are in different departments, but working in generally the same area, gather around this table and they meet. So here, Professor Dugan is meeting with Professor Blaskowitz, and for the first time, and some ways in which they could collaborate. Wonderful. So, Professor Blaskowitz is an assistant professor of music history at Penn State University. He is one of the numerous brilliant young faculty that our university has been able to hire in recent times because of the notoriety, the prestige of our departments, and our music department is well known and highly respected, and we were able to recruit somebody Dr. Blaskowitz's caliber. His current research expertise include 19th century French culture, opera, street music, urban history, empire and imperialism, and sound studies. Jack's current book project, entitled Fanfare for a City, Music and the Urban Imagination in 19th Century Paris, uncovers the foundational role that urbanization plays in shaping the city's musical life. Focusing on the years 1848 through 1900, the book shows how shifting attitudes towards composing, consuming, and listening to music paralleled how Second Empire Paris was designed as a capital of the 19th century. Dr. Blaskowitz has presented his work at meetings at the American Musicological Society, the Royal Musical Association, and the Biennial Conference on 19th Century Music. His writings are published or forthcoming in the Journal of Musicology, Current Musicology, 19th Century Music Review, Notes, the Journal of the Music Library Association, and the edited volumes, Musical Theatre in Europe, 1830 through 1945, so he has been the recipient of numerous grants, including a Fulbright Fellowship to France for the 2015-2016 academic year, the Alvin H. Johnson AMS 50th Dissertation Fellowship from the American Musicological Society, and the Iliada University Prize for the Midwest, from the Midwest chapter of the AMS. He holds a musicology, a PhD in musicology from the Eastman School of Music. Before joining the music history faculty at Wayne, he taught at Williams College, Eastman, and Stony Brook University. Today he is giving his first brown bag talk entitled Splintered Urbanism, Music, Popular Theater, and the Cultural Geographies of 19th Century Paris. So welcome Professor Blaskowitz to the podium.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Professor Edwards for inviting me to the Humanities Center. I'd like to thank Professor Duncan and the music faculty for going easy on me in this, my first semester on the tenure track. And thank you to all of you for coming out. I look forward to meeting all of you. I recognize some faces, but I think this is such a great venue to try out new ideas. So that's kind of what I'm doing today. Basically, first part of the talk, I'm going to give you a kind of a précis of the book project as it sort of stands right now. Then I'm going to kind of launch into a section of a chapter that I'm currently working on. So all of this is very much a work in progress, and I'm trying out some new ideas today, so I welcome any feedback or critique you may have at the end, or during if you feel so inclined. Do you want to start with some music?
Yes.
So just to kind of get our ears into the sound world of the 1860s, I'm going to play for you a very popular chanson populaire from 1864. This was premiered by the Café singer Teresa, we see here on the left. Rien n'est sacré pour un sapeur. So basically, nothing is sacred for a soldier. It's one of many songs that Teresa sang that kind of bridge working class life and high bourgeois sensibilities. So kind of day in the life kind of image. So listen for some of the rhythmic drive of the accompaniment. Obviously this is a much later recording from 1927, but you'll hear some of that kind of like double pattern, very strong downbeat, and kind of strophic rhythms, so basically repeated over and over. The point of these songs was to be catchy. The text didn't matter as much as the kind of musical delivery. So the verses are very much drinking song. The technical term is an oompa rhythm, so this kind of really strong kind of downbeat. But then it takes kind of an operatic turn at the end. There's kind of a pause in the music, a little cadenza. So that's kind of the spectacle of the whole thing. So this is sort of the scope of the project is 1850s and 1860s. So I'm going to sort of introduce to you the sort of premise of the book project. During Napoleon III's Second French Empire, 1853 to 1870, the bureaucrat Baron Haussmann engineered one of the most dramatic urbanization projects in European history, a near total demolition of the serpentine medieval streets of Paris and the construction of monumental boulevards, buildings, and vistas. Although it attempted to erase the city's pre-Napoleonic past, Haussmannization, as it was called, also inspired new ways of experiencing modernity. Literary and art historians have long examined the effects of urbanization on sensory experience, yet its effects on listening practices remains underexplored. What role did music and musicians play in glorifying or undermining the Haussmannization of Paris? More broadly, how did sound factor into the construction of a modern urban metropolis? So, Fanfare for City, Music and the Urban Imagination in 19th Century Paris. In that I explore the foundational role that the urbanization of Paris played on altering musical practices in the city. By uncovering the sonic worlds of civic ceremonies, mass protests, theatrical productions, and street commerce, I show how the Parisian soundscape became an integral theme in modernist narratives about a nouveau Paris, a new Paris, a metropolis at a crossroads between its treasured medieval past and its cosmopolitan imperial future. I ultimately argue that shifting attitudes towards composing, consuming, and listening to music paralleled the ways in which Second Empire Paris was planned, policed, and mythologized as a modern capital of the 19th century. In short, what I'm interested in is a sonic aesthetics of Haussmannization, how public works projects sought to manage musical infrastructure networks, musical communities, and the sensory experience of the city, and how those communities responded in turn. By combining new archival findings with perspectives on the emerging field of historical sound studies, Fan54 City sheds new light on little-known music by Berlioz, Delibes, Offenbach, Rossini, Saint-Saëns, and Wagner, recounts the stories of forgotten street musicians, some of who you'll meet today, and seeks to bring into conversation the fields of music history, material history, and urban studies. So my talk today is drawn from a chapter of the book. It examines Parisian street and cafe musicians and their representation in cartoons, memoirs, and police records. Through their lyrics, as well as through published memoirs, songwriters offered vivid commentary on economics and politics in Second Empire Paris, often focusing on the detrimental effects of urbanization on everyday musical life. I argue that Parisian popular music, far from being a trivial distraction, offered passers-by alternative, at times subversive, narratives about urban living, construction and demolition, and the tensions between city and country. So I want to talk a little bit about my title and some of the methodology that I'm working through right now. So scholars of 19th century French music overwhelmingly focus on opera. I love opera, but there's this overwhelming focus on the operatic experience as almost a metonym for all musical experience. Without a doubt, the opéra, or the main opera house, known as the Académie Nationale de Musique, has reigned as the most prestigious and well-funded musical institution in Paris since the 18th century. There are, however, two reasons why I mostly avoid the opéra in my project. Firstly, as many scholars have noted, grand opera as a genre declined in popularity after 1850. The model of new spectacles every year gave way to an operatic canon of classics, so the works heard there did not necessarily reflect the sentiments of everyday life, because the operatic canon was kind of coming into being. Second, the blossoming of new genres like operetta and vaudeville and actually féerie, as we were just discussing, meant that the Parisian musical scene became more diverse than ever before. Furthermore, the explosion of popular song, thanks to new copyright laws and venues, I'm thinking of SACEM, which is kind of like the French ASCAP, founded in 1849 and still around to this day, meant that Parisians looking for the newest musical takes on modernity looked to the popular music industry, and not to the increasingly fossilized repertory of the opéra. This division between the opéra and the popular music industry had spectacular consequences in how art and popular music coexisted in the French capital. So I argue that the Second Empire theater industry was splintered between what I call establishment theater and radical theater. The former, typified by the opéra, was a curated spectacle that conformed to the guidelines of the 1807 Napoleonic Code and the 1864 Theater Decentralization Law. The latter, typified by the Café Concert, had a porous, moral, generic, and geographic set of borders that were difficult to define and regulate. I adapt the word splinter from geographers Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin, who wrote about the ways in which infrastructure networks, including physical, utility, information, and communication technologies, can fragment the experience of the city. The result of tracing these splinters, Graham and Marvin argue, is a new socio-technical way of understanding contemporary urban change. Adapting this method to 19th century urban music offers a new way to resist the prevalent notions of teleological modernity that plague the historiography of the city. Paris's cafe industry, and this includes taverns and bars, as well as the more hybrid models like the Café Concert, which I'll explain to you later, thus represents a splintered infrastructure network of entertainment, insofar as they eluded clear categorization along aesthetic, economic, and geographical lines. It was a menace to Haussmann and his conception of a monumental, homogenized metropolis. So, without further ado, here is a portion of the chapter on street song and cafe music. In 1867, the critic, translator, and historian Charles Nizard published a 2-volume history of Parisian street songs. The second volume opens by describing how street songs pervaded both the visual and sonic landscape of the city. And the quote is on the slide. There is not a person who, walking along the quays, does not notice from a distance the rows of little booklets of equal dimensions that are spread over the guardrails and weighted down by pieces of flint. There is not a person who, in certain neighborhoods where there are still gardens, does not notice those same booklets suspended from strings along walls, flapping in the wind in opposite directions. One also sees them in construction zones, spread out over the rubble, or lining fences that cordon off work zones. These little booklets are street songs. Street songs, Nizar implies, are both seen and heard. Publishers printed song texts on cheap paper, such as feuilles or single leaves, or as pocket-sized collections known as cahiers, recueils, or chansonniers. Song texts were blown up on posters like this one, and plastered on walls, fences, and along construction sites, and reprinted in magazines, newspapers, and calendars. On any given day, a Parisian could hear the same chanson performed at a café-concert, listen to it bellowed by a marchand de chansons, or a song street vendor, or simply sing and play it at home. Hundreds of such chansons were performed, busked, and printed in Paris every month of the Second Empire. This ubiquity made the chanson populaire a potent element of the Parisian soundscape. Song flourished during the Second Empire because it was both commodity and currency. This chapter situates Paris's popular song industry within debates about morality, industrialization, and modernity. We find these debates embedded in the songs themselves. Songs served a variety of audiences, from rich bureaucrats to salon-hopping dandies, and to courtesans to workers. Through them, songwriters commented on a spectrum of contemporary issues, such as the influx of provincials to the city, the working conditions of street laborers, and the new technologies that increased flow between city and country. Songs about the French capital not only promoted the mythical view of Paris as world capital, but also identified the city in relation to its others, representing provincials and foreigners as out-of-place Parisian tourists. The chanson discussed in this chapter, a group culled from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris, and the Archives Nationales, offer a resonant account of how citizens and foreigners engaged with their changing urban environment. The chapter also examines how street musicians were represented as an urban subculture in newspaper reviews, cartoons, guidebooks, and memoirs. On the one hand, street musicians were regarded as iconic urban heroes whose lowly stature and haggard appearance undermined the manicured and pretentious habits of Second Empire's high society. On the other hand, tourist guides and police decrees cast these musicians as hindrances to the flow of urban life, while literary elites blamed street songs for the overall dumbing down of Parisian musical culture. These contested, splintered attitudes reflect the widespread ambivalence towards Haussmann's urbanization of Paris in the mid-19th century, and the distinct brand of fast-paced, mass-produced urban culture that it precipitated. Street songs have long played a decisive role in constructing spaces of congregation for Paris's socio-political communities. Indeed, their strong ties to discourses about modernization extend back to the French Revolution. Rarely was it possible for political reasons to say exactly what you wanted in song. Rather, meanings were obscured and refracted, and depended as much on the context of performance as on content and authorial intent. Unlike orchestral concerts of the early 19th century, which, as James Johnson reminds us, became less about socializing and more about aesthetic contemplation, the culture of popular singing consists of several interrelated elements: the choice of space, the freedom or lack thereof to participate, the means of distributing the music, and, especially during the Second Empire, the bureaucratic relations between songwriters, patrons, and censors. It is precisely this malleability that makes the chanson populaire such a rich resource for studying the everyday encounters of Parisians. Most songs have hazy source histories, meaning their success lay less in the fame of the authors and more in the context of their performance and reception. Journalists and the police were the primary creators of these songs' reception histories. Laura Mason, writing about revolutionary music making, notes that Parisian song culture, quote, was characterized by a sharp distinction between, on one hand, compositional and performative practices that were shared by French men and women from the court to the Pont Neuf, the bridge where a lot of street music was heard, and on the other hand, by cultivated representations, which described singing as a vulgar means of expression that was not taken to be serious as cultural or political expression. So that was Laura Mason. This perceived lack of seriousness allowed songwriters to smuggle all sorts of topics into their lyrics, from working conditions to tourism to city planning. There was little correlation between audience and class, and therefore little opportunity to take personal offense. Songs glossing on working class life were particularly welcome in factories and taverns. This blue-collar taste for bourgeois entertainment offered Parisian workers what Jacques Rancière would call dreams of evasion. Catchy tunes and picturesque images of city life allowed workers to see themselves as part of the mainstream urban conversation. During the Second Empire, songs of all varieties circulated both indoors and out. The same song could be heard on a street corner, in a tavern, or in a theater. Contemporary observers did not hesitate to regard even the most frivolous songs as markers of Parisian identity. One such song was the August 1864 smash hit Et Lambert, written by Félix Baumaine and set to the tune of La Belle Polonaise. Baumaine's verses, which repeatedly ask if anyone has seen a man named Lambert, sold 100,000 copies within days of being sent to the Marchands de Chansons, putting a tremendous strain on the printers. The song's popularity swelled after singer Alexandre Legrand gave an infectious performance at the Concert du 19e siècle, the sort of concert series of the 19th century, which was a café-concert on the Rue du Château d'Eau in the 10th arrondissement. The refrain shows the extent to which repetition was a driving factor in the song's catchiness. So it goes as follows. Have you not seen Lambert at the railway station? Have you not seen Lambert, 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 Lambert? Did he go swimming in the sea? Is he lost in the desert? Who's seen Lambert, 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 Lambert? The song is identified in the print version as a scie parisienne, or Parisian saw. A scie was a type of song that bordered on sense and nonsense, featuring a catchy, easy-to-remember refrain repeated ad nauseum. The famously moody critic Timothée Trim penned a front-page article on Et Lambert in Le Petit Journal. He begins by defining the scie as a, quote, repetition of a word, a sentence, or a question with the aim to exasperate the reader, to try his patience, to disrupt his solace. The enduring taste for scies from the 1860s through the end of the 19th century suggests an inverse relationship between perceived aesthetic value and mass popularity. Scies were lucrative because they were mostly nonsensical and thus less prone to censorship, making them all the easier to distribute and perform. Critics from both France and abroad worked to rationalize Lambert's evolution from an urban earworm to a commercial hit. In their journal entry on August 20th, 1864, the brooding brothers Edmond and Jules de Goncourt called for governmental intervention in bringing the fad to an abrupt end. As they complain, at this time in Paris, there is an epidemic of idiotic cries of Ohé Lambert, such as they need to be stopped by the police. In a far more sympathetic take on street song, the historian Henri Gourdon de Genouillac deploys language redolent of Baudelaire in his essay Les refrains de la rue, the refrains of the street. After a mere 8 days of popularity, observes Genouillac, albeit slightly exaggerating, it was over, faded, out of fashion. Others commented on how the cry reflected how the Parisian public often disregarded tact for the sake of amusement. Nizar, the author that we met earlier, observed that the Lambert craze accurately summarized contemporary Parisian sensibility and was an inevitable byproduct of la vie parisienne. As he writes, the song's success is evident. Nothing is more consistent with the temperament of the people of Paris. News of the song's popularity soon made its way to London critics, many of whom pounced on the chance to compare Victorian and Second Empire sensibilities. In particular, the London Review of Politics, Society, Literature, Art, and Science offered a lengthy and sobering interpretation of Parisian mass culture. The review explains how Lambert was used as a protest cry against the Emperor Napoleon and Empress Eugénie during the August 15th imperial festivities. This was Napoleon Bonaparte's birthday. Led by a group of Parisian street urchins, a crowd of rowdy onlookers greeted the imperial cortege with cries of "Vive Lambert! Vive Madame Lambert!" much to the chagrin of the police authorities, as you can imagine. The London Review reporter notes that such irreverence was also heard during the final years of the Ancien Régime, when protesters bombarded Louis XVI's and Marie Antoinette's carriages with shouts of "À bas Capet! À bas Madame Capet!" which is a reference to an old Frankish king. This collective desire to nickname the emperor after a passing street fad betrays a distinctly Parisian impulse to stage everyday life as if it were a spectacle, and indeed to regard the city of Paris as one giant theatrical space. Following this account, the anonymous London Review writer launches into a diagnosis of modernity that is too prescient not to quote at length, so I'm projecting it up here. She writes, "The little incident, however unimportant from a political point of view, throws light, nevertheless, on the way in which Paris regards the Second Empire. For the present, it almost seems as if Paris had ceased to be a city of politicians. It has become a city of spectators. The empire is to the population of its great metropolis not so much a sad or joyous reality as a spectacle of pomp and magnificence. It is an institution, just as the Rue de Rivoli, or the Cirque Impérial, or the Boulevard des Italiens is an institution, something rich and tangible and flashing, which adds to the gaiety of the day. As the emperor rides along the street, he is received not with flushed cheeks and beating pulses, but with open mouths. His progress excites neither respect nor indignation, but simple curiosity. When France receives her elected emperor with an extemporaneous charivari, it is plain that she is not in the habit of connecting his name with any particular idea. He is in their eyes something to be looked at, and for anything they care, they can pleasantly receive him with the comical cry, "Voilà, Lambert." The Lambert craze of 1864, as this report, and there are several others which I don't quote here, attest, epitomized many of the myths associated with the Second Empire. The ephemerality of fashion and of taste, the speed at which news traveled, and the juxtaposition of imperial gravitas with an utterly inane inside joke whose origins were ultimately unclear. These myths would later inform 20th century notions of modernity. The Frankfurt School critic Siegfried Kracauer cited Lambert in his book Offenbach und das Paris seiner Zeit to argue that the song encapsulated Paris's love for the ephemeral. Notwithstanding Krakauer's Marxist reading of Parisian popular culture, a reading that a lot of scholars have taken issue with, musicologists continue to explore how 19th century popular music shaped everyday life in cities. As Jane Fulcher, who's actually up in the University of Michigan, has noted, Second Empire composers, writers, and theorists regarded this genre of the chanson populaire as a, quote, pure musical form that pervaded the musical aesthetics in France in the guise of a model. This model, moreover, provided a musical canvas onto which composers could manufacture collective memory. The very act of collecting and writing about songs contributed not only to nationalist fervor, but also, as Sindhu Revoluri notes, to the rise of the academic disciplines of music history and music harmony. 19th century popular music thus served as a litmus to gauge morality, taste, and general well-being in the French capital. As we have seen, a single song or refrain could infiltrate urban spaces as diverse as train stations, parks, living rooms, public squares, and even theater boxes. But as far as 19th century guidebooks were concerned, the Café Concert was ground zero for the chanson populaire during the Second Empire. Part drinking hall, part theater, the Café Concert emerged around 1849 and became a staple of Parisian entertainment. As the French musicologist Concetta Condemi has noted, these establishments were everywhere. Between 1860 and 1890, 37%, or approximately 121, of cafes were situated in the 9th, 10th, and 11th arrondissement. About a quarter were in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 18th, and the remaining 38% were scattered throughout Paris, including the peripheries. Admission was free, but customers were required to buy drinks. Patrons were also free to roam around during song sets, to talk openly, to enter and exit as they pleased. This model of theater going was a stark contrast to the more serious theaters, which required patrons to navigate a series of vestibules, staircases, and boxes in order to ensure complete separation between the stage and the street. In the 1850s, private investors dumped large sums of money on constructing café concert venues along the Champs-Élysées and the newly built Boulevard de Strasbourg, thereby creating a disparity in quality between lavish establishments located in the center of Haussmann's Paris and shabbier ganguettes, as they were called, in the peripheries. By the 1860s, cafes were everywhere, and many of them featured some form of music making. As Jules Arnoux asked in his guidebook, Paris et sa splendeur, he writes, "What does Paris have more than cafes? Nothing, except the pavement of the streets. In popular neighborhoods, it is difficult to take 20 steps without encountering one." So the most dangerous aspect of cafes and taverns, Arnoux suggests, was precisely their ubiquity. Despite their casual nature, Café Concert were still restrictive in many ways. Patrons had to make sure their liquor glasses were full, or they would be asked to leave. From the performance side, promising musicians had to maneuver through mafia-like conditions of patronage and promotion, while real celebrities like Teresa, who was the premier singer of that song we heard, or the theater singer Brasseur, were far and few in between. The street corner thus remained the most readily available performance venue in Paris. The street corner provided musicians an impromptu stage, a rotating audience, and, when police approached, a fast escape. The street was also a natural annex to the Café Concert. Performers of the Café Concert were known to greet patrons outside the venues during intermission, and while the free admission policy of most Café Concert guaranteed a steady flow of audience members entering and exiting the space, street musicians were keenly aware of this urban porosity. As Genouillac writes in Les Refrains de la Rue, the most popular Café Concert hits were, quote, ground on barrel organs, tapped on the pianos, and scraped on violins. Perhaps no other musical community, then, better understood modern urbanism than that which made its living outdoors. Street musicians rarely attained the level of renown as did their café counterparts. However, due to the increasing popularity of literary flânerie in the 1850s and 60s, ambulant musicians became mythological figures of the Parisian streetscape, and writers depicted them at once as heroes, villains, and victims. They maintained the pulse of modern life, literally, really, and created, as literary historian Aimé Boutin writes, quote, equilibrium between urban noise and harmonious beauty. In his The Painter of Modern Life, Charles Baudelaire mused that the modern urbanite marvels at the, quote, amazing harmony of life in the capital cities, a harmony so providentially maintained amid the turmoil of human freedom. And as always, the mix of sensory metaphors is brilliant here. The sonic harmony, the sort of spatial turmoil. the journalist Charles Iriart shared Baudelaire's fascination with the street performer. A devoted flaneur himself, who was deeply moved by the destructive effects of Haussmann's urbanization on street life, Iriart maintained that street performers helped define the city as a conglomeration of picturesque, strange, and diverse urban spaces. Tomorrow, Iriart lamented in his book La Célébrité de la Rue, it will be too late to write a book such as this. Urbanization would instead cleanse the Parisian street of its most unique and enduring characters. He continues, farewell to the gaiety of our public squares, farewell to the gaudy costumes, to the strange songs, to the open-air dentists, ouch, to the street musicians. I swear to you, gentlemen, that Paris will become dull. It will be filled with nostalgia for the picturesque. Some street musicians did manage to earn renown and income in the music publishing industry. One of the most famous street singers was Eugène Théodore Baumeister, who was born in Paris in 1808 and died there in 1892. The son of a respected street singer himself, Baumeister was singing in the streets of Paris by the age of 4. At his peak in the 1850s, he was most often seen and heard outside the Cirque d'Hiver. The busy intersection was home to the circus as well as public bathhouses, making for an ideal spot to attract pleasure-seeking pedestrians. Baumeister resisted the stereotype of the panhandling street musician, and this is becoming clear was definitely a myth of modernity as much as this kind of utopian metropolis was a myth of Haussmann. So Baumeister instead sought to project himself as an enterprising musical professional, breaking with this stereotype. He was successful. Between 1832 and his death, Baumeister published hundreds of original songs, either as single-leaf feuilles or as bound cahiers. Despite his success, Baumeister never attempted to conquer the café-concert stage. Instead, he continued to attract street crowds into the second half of the century, selling collections of his printed music as well as the popular songs of his contemporaries, to which he was often given sole publishing rights. In 1869, the daily paper L'Orchestre called Baumeister, quote, the doyen of Parisian street singers. Baumeister's confidence was high. In the 1870s, his published song collections, titled La Chanson des Rues, which you see on the slide, included the epigraph, which is at the very bottom. Despite those jealous, villainous fools, the people continue to listen to my songs with pleasure. The songs of these collections featured the epigraph beneath an illustration of an organ grinder. Unlike the aging, anonymous grinder of the earlier image that we saw, which was this one, Baumeister's youthful organist is the center of attention. Surrounded by a diverse and attentive crowd of onlookers, the organist grinds with one hand and sells sheet music with another. The posters in the background feature the names of famous French chansonniers from the 18th and 19th centuries, as if suggesting a lineage that linked Baumeister to bards like Pierre-Jean de Béranger. Baumeister used this type of imagery as a mode of self-fashioning. Unlike the café singer, whose success was in essence manufactured by the impresario, the street singer needed to work hard to resist the haggard image that was so popular at the time among poets and illustrators. Though often depicted as urban curiosities, street musicians possessed considerable agency. If they wanted it, that is. Baumeister both wrote and performed music, which meant that he had both a platform and an audience for self-expression. Baumeister had at his disposal relationships with printers and bureaucrats. Yet nearly all of Baumeister's compatriots are now forgotten, or in fact have never been acknowledged in the first place. A major reason for this marginalization was policing. Although some evidence of these forgotten musicians survives in the form of identity cards and police summons, the Second Empire succeeded in lumping street performers into a single category, thereby making them easier to monitor through policy. The Préfecture de Police wrote their own narrative of the city by treating the regulation of the urban soundscape as a moral issue. The history of 19th century street music is closely tied to the policing of Parisian urban space. Throughout the 19th century, street performers dealt with an ebb and flow of police regulations. In general, a relatively stable government meant relaxed restrictions on what and where they could perform, while the years surrounding revolutions and regime changes meant more severe regulations. Each of the French regimes of the 19th century regarded uncontrolled street music as a potential threat to general moral welfare. A police decree passed on July 4, 1816, 2 years into the Bourbon Restoration, demonstrates the severity with which both the municipal prefecture and the state ministry treated undocumented street musicians. Following a series of reports submitted to or by the police, street musicians were accused of causing discord, either because they sang, quote, licentious songs, or because they caused congestion in public spaces. Voie publique is the word that is often used. As a result, the Bourbon police issued a new law requiring all organ grinders to obtain a license from the prefecture and renew it yearly. Any musician caught without documentation, the decree continues, would be, quote, severely punished. Licensing became the primary means of controlling the number and geographic distribution of street musicians in Paris. The annual renewal process detailed in the 1816 decree became every 6 months in 1830, the year the July monarchy was established, and every 3 months in 1853, the first full year of the Second Empire. Yet this increased bureaucratic pressure did more than just hold street performers accountable. It reflected a desire to tighten street regulations as the city was being urbanized. According to a police report dated December 14, 1831, street performers were no longer allowed to roam freely around Paris. Rather, they were for the first time restricted to specifically designated intersections, squares, and boulevards. Other spaces that musicians had frequented for centuries, such as the famed Pont Neuf, connecting the Ile de la Cité to the left and right banks, were henceforth off limits. The increased emphasis on licensing coincided with the increasing instability of the Parisian landscape. As streets changed shape, so too did the laws regulating them. Shortly after Haussmann's appointment as prefect of the Seine in 1853, the laws regarding street performers underwent a series of substantial reforms. A police decree issued on November 30th, 1853, grouped 4 distinct professions under the same legal category of, quote, street performer: clowns, barrel organists, street instrumentalists, and singers. As a result, all extant certificates were annulled, requiring street performers to reapply to the prefecture for their licenses and medallions. Applications also included a comprehensive list of designated public performance spaces, and that's what you see here on the slide. After 1860, which was an important year because that's when the outer peripheries were annexed, so Montmartre, Belleville, and the other ones. So the city expanded from 12 arrondissements to the current 20. That was 1860. Street musicians had 63 options across Paris's 20 arrondissements. Performers were strictly forbidden from congregating on sidewalks, in front of market entrances, or near other designated voies publiques. The large majority of acceptable spaces were intersections, squares, and along certain sections of the newly widened boulevards. While Haussmann and the prefecture of the Seine concerned themselves with demolition and construction, the prefecture of police was tasked with establishing a new moral order within Le Nouveau Paris. Those street performers who wished to reapply following the 1853 decree now needed to provide a, quote, certificate of good moral standing. New curfew hours placed stricter regulations on both kinetic and oral activity outdoors. Between October 1st and April 1st, clowns, barrel organists, street instrumentalists, and singers could only perform between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening. and during the warmer months, between 8 and 9 in the evening. Other measures were taken to prevent performers from exploiting children, which is, after all, a good thing. The 1853 decree prohibited children under 16 years of age from performing in the streets for money, or even to accompany performers of legal age. Together, these measures represented the empire's systematic efforts to regulate street activity according to an implied code of conduct. Osmanization, thus, was as much a moral project as it was a geographic one. We have seen how café concert and street corners functioned as porous, interactive performance spaces in Second Empire musical life. It is thus unsurprising that both saw increased police presence in the middle decades of the century. In the 1830s and 40s, song culture was largely contained within goguettes, singing societies, in which members shared their songs with one another. The emergent café concert of the 1850s, however, were not exclusive clubs, but rather a combination of drinking hall and theater. Police flowed freely through the cafes and café concerts alike, as drunkenness was not only a disturbance to fellow patrons, but also a distraction to performers. The introduction of beat policing in 1854, as historian W. Scott Hayne has noted, was another way that officials could monitor urban activity on an intimate level. By the 1870s, some cafe owners noted that police patrols passed their cafes every 30 minutes. Café concerts located in Paris's peripheral poor neighborhoods received considerably more police attention than did the affluent central establishments such as the El Dorado and the Café aux Ambassadeurs. Yet, as Donald James Olson has observed, Haussmann's own conception of Parisian urban space, miles, or kilometers I guess, of straight boulevards crisscrossing the city, encouraged the idea that geographic order predicated a moral order. Haussmann's Paris, writes Olson, was a, quote, deliberate artistic creation intended not merely to give pleasure, but to contain ideas, inculcate values, and serve as tangible expressions of systems of thought and morality, end quote. By extension, the opposite of moral order was filth, noise, and vulgarity, caused in large part by unchecked interactions of high and low social classes within the same urban space. One of the most damning accusations of café music came from the bureaucrat and philosophy professor Jules Simon, 1814 to 1896. Following the coup d'etat, the longtime Republican was ousted from his seat as chair of philosophy at the Sorbonne after refusing to swear allegiance to the new imperial government. Later, as Minister of Public Education under the Paris Commune, Simon took a hardline stance towards what he believed to be the moral evils pervading the singing cafes that originated during the Second Empire. As he claimed in an official report, no matter how severely we scrutinize the productions intended for these establishments, no matter how strict the surveillance of the prefecture of police may be, the evil today lies in the very existence of these places where people smoke and drink, where in a world people get together without any conception of morality or art, simply to spend the evening being vulgar. Simon's argument rests on the causal relation between working class behavior and public security. He seems to imply that suppression rather than education was the key to creating a moral and socially homogeneous urban population. In fact, his moralistic view was echoed in a report from the prefect of police at the time. And this report reads, quote, "If I were able to suppress them all, I wouldn't hesitate for one moment. I am forever preoccupied with the desire to combat hateful music with decent, honest music," end quote. As Jacques Rancière has observed, these so-called hateful street songs of the later Paris Commune generated paranoia among the politicians of the fledgling Third Republic, as it reminded them of the social disparities between the ordered city center and the diverse, insurrectionary and splintered Parisian peripheries. For many proponents of Haussmann's Nouveau Paris, the epitome of moral licentiousness was Carnival, the indulgent Catholic celebration directly preceding Lent. In Paris, the place to celebrate Carnival was Belleville, the historically working-class commune in the hills to the east of Paris, which was annexed by the city in 1860. The main celebration in Belleville was the Descente de la Courtille, a festival that was accompanied by heavy drinking and partying. The July Monarchy and later the Second Republic police tried to prevent the merriment from bleeding into the central arrondissement, but these attempts were largely unsuccessful, I think because it's a hill, so everything kind of rolled downhill. Year after year, composers, playwrights, and songwriters glorified the event through vaudevilles, symphonic works. Wagner, for example, wrote an early piece for the Descente de la Courtille. It's terrible, but it was his first of many failed attempts to conquer the city. And, of course, street songs. A main draw to the event was the low price of alcohol. Before its annexation into Paris, Belleville sat outside of Paris's barrières, or gates, and thus was a part of a different taxation scheme. Ultimately, the Second Empire Prefecture of Police quashed the descente once and for all. First by expanding the radius of the octroi, or city tax, then by outlawing the celebration once Belleville officially became a part of the city of Paris. The gradual suppression of the Descente de la Courtille had a devastating economic impact on working-class community organizations in Belleville, especially those centered around communal song and drink. Supporters of the tradition lamented the government's taxing of what was regarded a cultural institution. In 1864, Alfred Delvaux commented on how the suppression of the event sapped the, quote, festive spirit of the Parisian working class. As he writes, the Descente de la Courtille is about to give up the Parisian ghost that it had taken in the wrong direction. This tradition diminishes from year to year, like everything else that is at the mercy of our tastes, and yet we do not gain anything in morality. Others complained that canceling the event damaged the economy of Paris's outer neighborhoods. One song from 1858, titled Hommage au Choral de Belleville, addresses not only the dissolution of the descente, but also the alcohol tax hike that followed. I'm going to read that because the screen's off. Fleeing the big city, fearful of the atmosphere, cordiality is exiled to the periphery. Although the government regarded the celebration as a site of morally bankrupt drunkenness, the song alludes to an artistic working class culture, I guess what Richard Florida today would maybe call the creative class, that economically depended on sociability around low-priced drink. Hommage au Choral de Belleville was premiered at a chansonnier banquet in Belleville on December 18, 1858, by the community chorus of Belleville. Far from being a group of drunks, this chorus was in fact an established lyrical association that won annual medals in Orphéon choral competitions. The song's final stanza, which laments the rising tax and the wane of organized social events in Belleville, was a polemic aimed at the imperial regime's unforgiving attitude towards working-class cafe culture. Let us drink, because the Paris border tax extending its reach will raise the price of the wine of the Parisian peripheries. So just to briefly conclude, Hommage au Choral de Belleville, my final example today, shows how Parisian chansons populaires were deployed for a variety of uses, entertainment, homage, and protests. As I have shown in my talk, songs provided a means of spreading a message into a diverse set of urban, public, and private spaces. Although many chansonniers sung the empire's praises and embraced Haussmann's vision, I have a lot of those in the chapter, others provided an alternative mythology, a Paris that more closely resembled a falling Atlantis than it did a rising utopia. This multivalence was precisely what made songs at once attractive and dangerous. When viewed as both sources of entertainment and as conduits of information, Parisian popular songs offer a window into the fashions, anxieties, and ideologies underpinning an increasingly splintered Second Empire society. Thank you very much.
Some questions and comments.
So I should say that the chapter kind of organizes my song analysis into two groups. One around new Paris, or songs that overtly praise some of the urban works projects as being positive. And then this is sort of the second half of that chapter, the sort of old Paris as being almost a mask for a subversive attitude towards Haussmann. Yes?
As you were saying that, the thing that I was thinking about was Toulouse-Lautrec. Am I thinking of the right period?
No, but okay. That's a little bit later. It's a little bit later.
Okay, well, I was just thinking of him as him sketching, and I remember all those dancing and everything going on. And then I thought of, was that kind of thing, was that continued modifying you said later on, but was it the same kind of thing? Because I remember sketches of people drinking absinthe and all that. Was that part of that? That was part of the means to control the working class?
Well, for sure. I mean, the absinthe drinking sketches, I mean, Manet was doing that in the 1860s already, so that was definitely part of the narrative. I think, my whole project rests on the premise that visual and literary representation was a crucial element of responding to urbanization. This is a very well-trodden path of inquiry. What I'm talking about, or trying to in the book project, is how did people listen? How was sound as an object, as a commodity, different in the way that it provided a splintered reading of Second Empire society? Not everybody was into the skirts, the absinthe. There were also other types of communities. Urbanization or Osmanization was not a kind of teleology as the empire would have liked to think. It was more of a conflict between new sounds and old sounds.
So I guess I did find it interesting that a lot of the Café Concert were in that area near Montmartre, Pigalle, which later on do become kind of those sites where, was there then a split between the Café Concert culture of those neighborhoods that were more located in lower class or working class neighborhoods versus the Champs-Élysées, I imagine? So was there a split there as far as the ideology of the songs or the functions of the songs?
The challenge with studying the Café Concert was that there was no repertory list. Any impresario who owned a Café Concert needed to run the set list by the censors on a daily basis.
Oh, wow.
The repertoire was not written down on a program because, again, that kind of think of that like porosity between the street and the space. You can come in and out as you please. Singers kind of decided that day or that moment what they would hear, what they would perform. The big hits were kind of written on a wooden board on the side of the stage for the performers, but there was a lot of interaction between audience and performers. The audience would often shout what they wanted to hear, and the performers would often oblige. So from a musical perspective, it's kind of a challenging thing to study. And this goes back to your comment about Toulouse-Lautrec. So the Café Concerts of the 1850s in particular were these kind of social fluid spaces. They were not theaters, strictly speaking. Eventually, the sort of monumental Café Concert that were built along the Champs-Élysées or along the sort of the north-west axis, the Strasbourg, Sebastopol, sort of the center, those were more sites of spectacle. They were giant. They were 1,500-seat auditoriums. That became the new model for new genres known as music hall and cabaret. And those are really the genres that define Third Republic 1880s, 1890s culture. So the Café Concert is not the same thing as the cabaret. There has to be an important generic distinction here, which again, from an ontological perspective, it's very difficult to kind of talk about what a café concert is and isn't. So.
Your first slide depicted multitudes of the printed musical scores and songs.
Are you thinking of this one?
No, you opened up with like, you see them everywhere,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
the songbooks.
Yeah.
So if they were mass produced and distributed, people all had these as they were singing in the streets? I mean, this was the instrument where the people all gathered to sing the songs? They had these things in hand?
First of all, the songbooks typically did not have sheet music. The way that songs were written is there would be new text, which would be run by the censors via the publisher. They would be set to a tune. That's called contrafactum. So setting new words to an old tune. There was a large songbook of tunes that were popular in the 19th century. They were known as the Clés de Caveau, and this was an edition that was reissued since I think 1809. Kind of like, think about like the Great American Songbook, except if you just like took the melody and added new words to it, something like that. So you would have the title of the new song and then air de, and then you would know the melody. So you would know that the sort of rhythm of the melody would be how you set the new text. So it's really just the poetry, really, that's being kind of distributed.
That's interesting because I've been working a little bit with the Féerie, and you'll have the play and then the interludes where it'll have the sung sections and it'll have the air to, it follows this song. So that's kind of interesting because this was the whole question of copyright was very different at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean, the whole reason why copyright was invented is because two songwriters went to a vaudeville theater and heard their song performed. And they were like, what the hell? Can I get royalties? And they're like, no, that's not a thing.
Right.
So they went and started SACEM, which is like the ASCAP for French music. So that was a huge problem. And from a sort of scholarly perspective, again, like the ontology of these things, like what was the work that was heard, the vaudeville as a musical work? If you had these insertions that changed from night to night, how can you talk about a single vaudeville as you would, for example, an opera, where there is a score, there's an addition, there's some kind of a thing to it, right? So that's kind of the challenge of studying this repertory in general. But it's a fun challenge.
Was that mostly a clash also between the upper class culture and the working class culture, and that what were the upper class doing? Were they doing a similar thing, or was there just a suppression of just working class people?
The idea that each class had their own music was kind of a fiction. As I mentioned earlier, workers loved stereotypical songs about workers as much as the haut bourgeois loved stereotypical songs about workers. The café concert were also fluid in the types of people who were there. There are various very vivid reports about the different clothing styles that you'll see in a single cafe space. So popular culture was really something that was enjoyed across the so-called high and low spectrum, but that is as much a myth of the sort of Second Empire imagination as anything else. Yes?
Yeah, I had a question. First of all, thanks for this presentation. This was really cool and interesting. A question about so we've talked a lot about kind of how these songs circulate and how they're consumed and then reproduced by people who are reading these sheets. I have a question about the people who are, I guess, producing the songs. So it sounds like what their work is like, because it's like that of a poet more than, I don't know, someone sitting out on a piano or something. How did they see what they were doing? Did they have a sort of self-conception or a consciousness as workers? Did they see themselves as artists? Were the same people who were, there were songs that were celebrating the new Paris and songs that were lamenting the loss of this old Paris, were they different people that were writing these songs, or did you have the same people that were writing to these two different audiences because there's a market there?
That's a fantastic question, and that is a challenge because we don't really have, or at least I wasn't able to find in my archival research thus far, these people didn't write memoirs, they don't have biographies written about them, they're largely forgotten people, and sometimes you have to dig really far to find who even wrote the text to a particular song. So I don't have a lot of that angle. What I do have is more established songwriters writing books about songs, and they will kind of frame the songs in a particular way. So Nizar wrote this 2-volume thing that I opened with. He himself was a songwriter as well. So his book has his own texts as well as those of others. And then it's kind of interpolated with the narrative about, demolition, and then he quotes several songs about demolition. Of course, he doesn't attribute anything, which is, again, a menace to me, because I can't really track anything down. I think I still need to work on how much I acknowledge curation in these discourses, as opposed to kind of trying to be the kind of righteous, let all of the workers speak for themselves and raise their voices out of the sort of dross of society, which is kind of a trend right now in humanities, at least. I really do need to kind of frame the narrative as there were still gatekeepers of those voices, right? Nizar being one of them, and other ones as well. So that's a fantastic point, and I think I need to think about that a little bit more as I sort of move forward.